By the end of the 1540s, Henry VIII was no longer the man who had once ruled from horseback. Over the years his body had changed beyond recognition. Excessive eating and the complete lack of movement had turned him into a man of enormous size, weighing well over 150 kilograms. His legs could no longer support the strain, and every attempt to stand brought sharp pain and breathlessness. Because of that, he relied on servants for even the smallest movement. 2 of them lifted him carefully by the arms whenever he needed to rise, while another followed close behind to keep his balance. His life had become a constant struggle with his own body, yet he refused to accept it. Instead of limiting himself, he surrounded his weakness with ritual. Each morning began with food, and each evening ended the same way. Meals became the structure that replaced every other routine. Entire tables were rolled into his private chamber so he would not need to walk, and dishes were arranged within reach. He was never left to eat alone. The courtiers were ordered to stay beside him, to talk, to entertain, to fill the silence, because the king said that an empty room made him feel too close to death. The court quickly adjusted to this new rhythm. Banquets replaced meetings, and the day's politics were discussed between courses. The dinners stretched deep into the night, and the business of the crown began to depend on the king's digestion. He ate slowly, often pausing to breathe, and ordered more as soon as the plate was cleared. He laughed loudly, burped openly, and passed gas at the table without concern. No one dared to react. It was forbidden to acknowledge anything his body did. When his stomach failed him and he vomited during the meal, the servants removed the basin and returned with new dishes as if nothing had happened. In Hampton Court, the kitchens worked without pause. Dozens of cooks prepared meat, pastries, and wine sauces from dawn until the next morning. The pressure was immense. If a dish disappointed the king, the cook was dismissed before sunrise. Fear drove them to excess, to make every meal richer, sweeter, and heavier than the one before. This only deepened the problem. Henry's appetite kept growing, while his ability to digest what he consumed was slowly collapsing. He gained more weight, and with it came exhaustion, irritability, and dependence on others for even the simplest tasks. His condition changed the way the kingdom was governed. When he became too large to ride to council, the council began to come to him. Ministers discussed state matters beside his table while he continued eating. His hands, swollen from poor circulation, struggled to hold a quill, and his fingers left stains of grease and wine on the papers he signed. England was now ruled by a man who could barely move, but whose authority remained absolute. Those who shared his table gained favor. Those who reminded him of his state risked disgrace or exile. Even his personal hygiene turned into a problem of logistics. Washing his enormous body required hours of work and left him exhausted, so it was done only when absolutely necessary. Servants wiped him with damp cloths, but the relief was brief. His clothes had to be regularly cut open and resewn as his size increased. The heat in his chambers was kept high to ease his joints, but it made the air stifling, and still he demanded that attendants remain nearby. Serving him was unpleasant, but no one dared to refuse, because being close to the king still meant power. By 1545, his appetite had become the center of royal life. Feasts replaced ceremony, and overeating became a silent form of loyalty. Courtiers began to copy the king's habits, gaining weight as a sign of devotion, and the entire court slowed to his rhythm. Ministers waited for him to finish eating before they spoke, and the machinery of the state moved forward only between his meals. The empire he had once built through war and ambition had shrunk to the size of a single room. Inside that room, surrounded by food and people too frightened to leave, Henry VIII ruled England not through strength or intellect, but through the endless repetition of appetite that had become stronger than his will. By the middle of the 1540s, Henry VIII's body had begun to collapse under the weight he had forced upon it. Years of overeating had destroyed his joints, his circulation, and his digestion. The same appetite that had once made him feel alive now worked against him. Each movement brought pain, each breath came shorter than the last. Because of his size he could no longer climb stairs or mount a horse, so ramps were built across the palace, and wide chairs with wheels replaced his throne. His servants carried him from bed to table and back again, and the days blended into one another. His legs were wrapped in layers of cloth soaked in medicine, but the swelling grew worse. The ulcers that covered his calves refused to heal, and pus leaked through the bandages, staining his clothes and bedding. The king's body was now in open rebellion. His stomach could no longer handle the food he demanded, yet he continued to eat out of habit and pride. After almost every meal he vomited, sometimes quietly into a basin beside the bed, other times violently in front of the court. The physicians called it a failure of digestion, but no one dared to tell him that it was self-inflicted. Instead, they mixed his food with wine to make it easier to swallow, which only worsened the problem. The combination of alcohol and fat left him bloated and sick, but he believed that eating was proof of strength, and any attempt to limit him was seen as betrayal. Hygiene had become almost impossible. Bathing required more energy than he could manage, and his servants struggled to move him safely. He refused to let anyone touch him except a few trusted attendants, and even they worked in silence. The room was kept warm to ease the pain in his joints, but the heat made the air thick and heavy. His sheets had to be changed twice a day, and his nightclothes were often cut away rather than removed. He spent most nights half awake, dozing between cramps and coughing fits. What little sleep he found was shallow and restless. The court around him grew tired of pretending that nothing was wrong. His closest advisors whispered that the king's temper had become unpredictable. When the pain in his legs increased, he shouted without reason. When his stomach turned, he blamed the cooks for poisoning him. Each day someone new was dismissed for an imagined offense. Those who remained learned to agree with everything he said. The business of the kingdom slowed because ministers feared to bring him bad news. His anger was dangerous, but his silence was worse. Physicians tried everything they knew. They drained his wounds, applied leeches, and changed his bandages several times a day. None of it helped. The infections returned, the pain grew stronger, and the king's patience disappeared. He cursed the doctors, called them incompetent, and demanded that they find comfort in wine instead of medicine. At meals he now required servants to lift the food to his lips. When he spoke, his words were slurred from exhaustion, and his mouth often trembled as he chewed. Even breathing became work. As his body failed, the court adapted again. The days of formal processions and long councils were gone. Government business was carried out in short sessions beside his bed. Papers were read aloud while he rested between bites. Orders were issued slowly, his mind still sharp but trapped inside a body that refused to cooperate. Each decision took longer, each signature came with effort. The rhythm of power had turned into a rhythm of survival, both for the king and for those who served him. By 1546 Henry was living entirely within the limits of his illness. The palace moved around him like a hospital disguised as a court. Servants spoke in whispers, physicians waited outside his chamber, and the scent of medicine filled the halls. He could no longer hide his condition, but he refused to acknowledge defeat. In his mind, to admit weakness was to surrender the throne. And so he continued to eat, to drink, to command, and to insist that everything was as it should be, even as his body made it clear that the reign of Henry VIII was being measured not by his rule, but by the time left before his strength ran out. By the late 1540s Henry VIII no longer appeared before his people. The king who had once been the center of public life had become a private figure, hidden within his palace, his world reduced to a few dim rooms and the men who still pretended to serve him. He was now too large to walk or ride, and his dependence on others was complete. Each morning began with attendants lifting him out of bed, wrapping his swollen legs in fresh bandages, and carrying him to the chair that served as both throne and table. From that seat he ruled, ate, and slept. His body dictated the pace of every day. The courtiers who surrounded him had learned the art of pretending. They praised his words, echoed his judgments, and laughed at his jokes, but when he was not listening they mocked him. They whispered about the noises that filled his chamber, the heavy breathing, the groans, and the smell that lingered after he had eaten. His abdomen was constantly swollen, and he released gas without restraint. The sound and odor followed him wherever he went, and the courtiers endured it in silence, pretending not to notice. Behind closed doors, however, they spoke about it freely. The humiliation was impossible to hide. The work of government slowed to a crawl. Letters waited for his signature while the king struggled to keep his eyes open. Reports were read to him, and he answered with short grunts that his secretaries later turned into royal decrees. Decisions that once required his judgment were now handled by advisors who claimed to know his will. The empire he had built through force and marriage was managed by others while he sat in silence, half asleep, breathing heavily, surrounded by plates and papers. His personal condition had worsened beyond repair. The ulcers on his legs grew deeper and began to rot the flesh beneath. The pain was constant, and the physicians could offer no cure. They cleaned the wounds daily, but the infection returned each night. The king's face was swollen, his skin yellowed, and his hands shook when he tried to lift a cup. Food no longer brought pleasure. He ate because it filled the hours, then vomited because his stomach rejected what it was given. Still, the routine continued. To change it would have meant admitting defeat, and Henry was incapable of admitting defeat. Among his servants, the fear that had once defined their service slowly turned into pity. They spoke to him softly, moved quietly, and avoided looking directly at him. The great figure who had commanded England now needed help to wipe his mouth and turn his body in bed. His dignity disappeared one task at a time. When he soiled himself, no one mentioned it. When he farted or groaned, they bowed their heads and continued their duties. The court that had once worshipped him now watched a man dissolve inside his own body. Outside the chamber, rumors spread that the king had lost his senses. Some said he no longer knew the day or the season. Others claimed he was haunted by guilt and refused confession. None of it mattered. What was visible to everyone was that the crown no longer rested on a ruler but on a patient. Even ambassadors began to report that England was governed by its council, not its king. By 1547, Henry rarely spoke of the realm. His conversations were about his comfort, how warm the room was, how often his bandages were changed, what food could be made soft enough for him to swallow. His moods shifted quickly from rage to silence. Some days he dismissed servants for imagined insults, other days he stared at the wall and said nothing for hours. The man who had terrified Europe now frightened no one but himself. The power that once filled entire courts had shrunk to the small circle of air he could still breathe. The courtiers knew it, the servants whispered it, and even the physicians stopped pretending he would recover. The throne still stood, but the man on it had already fallen. By the beginning of 1548, the king's body had become an open battlefield. His heart, liver, and kidneys were failing under the constant strain of weight and age. The ulcers on his legs had spread so far that physicians wrapped them in layers of cloth soaked in oil just to keep the skin from tearing when he moved. The infection reached his bloodstream and made his mind drift between sleep and confusion. He no longer remembered how many times he had been warned to eat less. Every warning had ended the same way, with another meal. The appetite that once symbolized his authority had turned against him. He demanded food not out of hunger but out of fear of emptiness. He ordered his servants to bring whatever they could prepare quickly, and when the trays arrived he ate without pause, chewing slowly, swallowing with effort, and then calling for more. His body could no longer process what it received. The stomach rejected the food almost immediately. He vomited several times a day, and every episode left him weaker. Still he insisted on eating again, certain that food was strength. His doctors could only obey. They blended meat and wine into thick soups to make swallowing easier, yet even that brought little relief. The pressure inside his abdomen grew unbearable. He suffered from constant bloating, and the gas that built up in his stomach escaped without control. The sound filled his chamber, sometimes accompanied by laughter from servants who thought he could not hear. The odor lingered in the air long after the meals were over, seeping into the curtains and the bed. The attendants whispered that even the physicians avoided staying too long in his presence. For them it was no longer a royal chamber but a place where illness and decay had taken full command. Each night the struggle grew worse. The king's breath rattled as he slept, and his attendants stayed close to the bed in case he called for them. When he tried to turn, pain shot through his legs and forced him to cry out. The physicians rotated in shifts, checking the pulse, changing the bandages, adjusting the pillows. Their reports were always the same. The infection was spreading. His heart was irregular. His lungs were filling with fluid. He was dying, but no one dared to say the word aloud. His temper grew worse with every passing week. The slightest discomfort could provoke an outburst. He accused his servants of disobedience, his cooks of neglect, and his physicians of conspiracy. One moment he demanded prayer, the next he cursed the clergy for reminding him of death. Those who once feared his anger now pitied it. His strength was gone, but his pride remained, and that pride made him blind to what his body had already decided. The palace adapted to his decline. Heavy curtains were drawn across the windows to protect him from the cold. Fires burned through the night to ease the stiffness in his joints. Servants spoke in whispers, their faces pale from exhaustion. Few outside the chamber saw him anymore. The once magnificent court of England had turned into a quiet hospital where the sound of coughing replaced the music that had once echoed through its halls. His condition forced the council to act without him. Documents were brought for his signature, but his hand shook so violently that others began to guide the quill across the page. Ministers managed most affairs on their own, sending messages abroad in his name. The monarchy continued out of inertia, moving forward because it could not stop. Henry remained trapped between denial and survival. He believed that as long as he gave orders, he was still king, and as long as he ate, he was still alive. But each day made it clearer that both were illusions. He slept sitting upright to ease his breathing, and even then he woke gasping for air. His once commanding voice had turned into a dry whisper. The servants who stayed beside him no longer saw a monarch. They saw a man whose body was shutting down in slow motion. By the spring of 1548, the king's physical collapse was beyond repair. The ulcers had deepened to the bone, and the constant gas and odor filled every corner of the palace. The attendants spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it the smell of the end. His doctors admitted privately that no medicine could help, but publicly they spoke of recovery. To admit failure would have been to admit guilt. So they kept him alive with small comforts, pretending the pain would ease, while everyone in the palace knew that Henry VIII had already crossed the point of no return. By the start of 1549, Henry VIII was living in a state between waking and death. His world had shrunk to the size of his bed, and every sound inside the chamber revolved around his breathing. The court still spoke of recovery, but no one believed it. The king no longer recognized the seasons. He asked what month it was and forgot the answer a moment later. His body was swollen beyond repair. The legs were wrapped in thick layers of cloth, the skin purple and cracked, and the belly rose and fell like a slow tide. The effort of eating, once his last proof of power, had turned into exhaustion. He chewed with difficulty, swallowed slowly, and then leaned back to catch his breath. The doctors whispered that his organs were failing one after another. He did not listen. He still ordered food. He said that a king should never go hungry. The smell in his quarters had become unbearable. Even the tapestries could not mask it. The mix of infection, wine, and gas lingered through the halls, and servants carried candles just to clear the air. They worked in silence, fearing both his anger and the sight of what he had become. Every night they washed the sheets, opened the windows for a few minutes, and whispered prayers that he would sleep through till morning. Few believed he would. The palace had grown quiet, the corridors empty, as if the kingdom itself was waiting for permission to move on. That night began like many others. The fire was kept low, and 2 attendants remained near his bed, watching for signs of pain. He demanded meat broth and wine before sleep, insisting it would strengthen him. When the food arrived, he took several slow sips, wiped his mouth, and dismissed the servants with a wave. He wanted no witnesses. The door closed, and for a while, the room was silent. Then came the familiar sounds, short gasps, a groan, the weight of his body shifting under the sheets. He tried to sit upright to breathe more easily, but his strength failed him. The pressure in his stomach rose again, and the wine he had drunk began to surge upward. He vomited suddenly, choking before he could call for help. The thick liquid filled his throat, cutting off air. He reached for the basin beside the bed, but his arm stopped halfway. The attendants rushed to him, lifting his shoulders, trying to clear the passage, but it was too late. His body convulsed once, then again, and the movement stopped. The room fell quiet except for the hiss of the dying fire. Henry VIII, the king who had ruled by appetite and fear, had died not on a battlefield or in council, but alone, overcome by the same excess that had defined his life. When dawn came, the servants moved carefully around the chamber. They opened the windows to let in the cold air and began to remove the sheets. The council gathered in silence. No one spoke of the cause. The official report spoke only of natural failure, but those who had served near him knew the truth. His body had given up long before his breath had stopped. It was not illness or age that killed him, but the years of indulgence that no one had dared to question. The news spread slowly through the palace. Some wept, others exhaled in relief. For the first time in years, the corridors smelled of smoke and clean air instead of medicine. The cooks extinguished their fires, and the physicians packed their instruments. The court began to speak of succession. Life moved forward, cautious and quiet, as if afraid to disturb the silence left behind. Outside the palace, England waited for its new ruler, unaware of the details that had taken place behind those doors. History would remember Henry VIII as the king who changed his country, who defied the church, who married 6 wives. Yet those who had stood close to him in his final years remembered something different. They remembered a man who could not stop feeding himself even as his body collapsed, who mistook appetite for power, and who died choking on the proof of his own excess. His death was not a tragedy of politics or faith, but a warning written in flesh, that power without restraint eventually consumes itself.